All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the School of Information Colloquium series. We're here today and very pleased to have our guest speaker, Thuy Vo Dang, Assistant Professor of Information Studies at UCLA, to share her research and knowledge with us. So please welcome Thuy, and we will be taking questions after the presentation. And for those of you on Zoom, I'll be monitoring the chat so that I can share your questions as well.
Thank you so much, Berlin. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my first time in Tucson. I'm really excited to be here. Hi, everyone on Zoom. I might move around a little bit, so I'm going to share my screen with you all. Can everyone on Zoom see the screen? Great, thank you. Okay, first I want to begin by thanking Andrea Tomer, Jamie Lee for inviting me to University of Arizona's iSchool to share a little bit of my current research, some past projects that I've worked on, and I'm still thinking through. And I have this working paper today, so I would love to engage all of you in some conversation after my presentation. So my presentation is called Transforming Education, Archives, and Community History, or TEACH. Friends of mine know that I have this penchant for acronyms. And so you'll see that these acronyms pepper throughout this presentation, and hopefully they all kind of gel and make sense. I want to begin by first positioning myself and sharing with you a little bit about why I care. And yes, that is an acronym to be explained later. So I want to talk first about positionality, power, and profession. So those of us who work in archives or archival education have witnessed a shift in how we think about care in our profession in the last decade or more. The emphasis has shifted toward people rather than only on the cultural objects we preserve. Moving away from the field's fixation with archival ethics and professional codes of conduct that centered on the physical preservation and conservation of archival materials as a form of care, our conceptualization of care has expanded to encompass broader moral and ethical concerns, relationships with communities, and the responsibilities of archivists towards historically marginalized groups. Similar to Jeanette Bastian, Michelle Caswell, Marika Seafor, and Gilliland and others who employ a feminist ethics of care in their scholarly and applied approaches to archives, I suggest that archivists and educators enter into the work with transparency regarding their positionality and relationship to power structures that both enable and limit their engagement with communities they serve. So for a decade, I worked at the intersection of ethnic studies, community archives, and academic library special collections. As curator of the University of California Irvine Library's Southeast Asian Archive, and you'll hear me use the acronym C, SEAA, the C. My duties involved collection development, reference, instruction, and outreach for the archival and circulating monographs collections related to the Cambodian, Hmong, Lao, and Vietnamese diaspora. Built in the 1960s, UCI is a public land grant, a university that occupies the unceded ancestral lands of the Ho Chi Minh peoples. Its student population is diverse, reflecting much of Southern California's racial demographics. As a relatively new university, the archival collections within the library reflect mainstream institutional priorities, the university's records, faculty papers on critical theory, and regional history. Let me close this so you can see. I need to see everyone there better. But a unique sort of gem of a collection can also be found there. One of UCI's important areas of collecting is on refugee and immigrant communities from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. In the late 1970s, so shortly after the founding of the campus, right, as Cold War refugees from Southeast Asia rapidly transformed the regional landscape around the university, community leaders approached UCI to document their history. Slowly, the efforts of a lone librarian named Anne Frank evolved into a community-centered archival collection, aided by advisors from within and outside the academy. I was appointed to steward the C long after Anne retired. I had gained some experience building a digital archives of oral histories for Vietnamese Americans, a project I directed as a postdoctoral fellow in UCI's Asian American Studies department from 2011 to 2013. After transitioning to my new role as an archivist, I also took on the duties of research librarian for Asian American Studies based on my subject expertise. This new area of responsibility expanded my bandwidth to foster close collaboration with a small ethnic studies department that serves students whose personal experiences and histories connect to the archival materials under my care. The Department of Asian American Studies, along with the other ethnic studies departments at UCI, was born out of student activism in the early 1990s. This was an era of retrenchment by universities as budget cuts threatened the most vulnerable of departments, especially ethnic studies. Trained as an ethnic studies scholar who benefited greatly from the activism of those who came before, I came into the library and information science profession with a strong commitment to anti-racist principles and practices and to bridging the university and community divide. My early days as a graduate student involved numerous visits to the UCI Southeast Asian Archive for archival research. Later, I practiced oral history and ethnography in the San Diego Vietnamese refugee community. Learning ethnic studies theories and learning from Vietnamese American elders impressed upon me the gaps that exist in the scholarly literature written within the archives. Your library doesn't have anything about me. This was a charge uttered by one of the first narrators I interviewed for my field research in the early 2000s. This phrase would haunt me over the course of my career, serving as a reminder that I must keep addressing the gaps, erasures, silences, and distortions in the historical record. Back then, I started to see the sea as a place with potential to address questions about power and knowledge production. I did not know it yet, but I would eventually land in the LIS profession centering questions about power and archival praxis. The Southeast Asian Archive is often discussed in scholarly literature as a model of community archives. By the time I was appointed its steward, though, in 2013, the archive had already been firmly established as a distinctive collection within the small Special Collections and Archives department. As such, it did not exactly fit into the definitions and descriptions proposed by archival studies scholars that define community archives as independent and/or grassroots. More than a decade ago, Anne Gilliland and Andrew Flynn suggested that one way to think about community archives is through the practice of individuals and communities collecting materials which they deem to be significant in ways that are not necessarily subject to professional oversight or located in formal institutional settings. In some countries, this practice has been recognized and described as community archiving. In other countries, different terms are used, and in others, still, such activities have received little or no recognition. Gilliland and Flynn's description, too soon, highlights the amorphous nature of community archiving, leaving room to imagine the multiple and even contradictory terms upon which archival materials might be assembled, preserved, and made accessible. Community archives are distinct from traditional institutional archives in that they are driven by and serve specific and often minoritized groups. They're independently created and maintained by groups to document their own histories, experiences, and cultural heritage, and often seek to counter the dominant narratives present in traditional archival institutions. This purposefulness and deliberate attention to silences, erasures, and distortions in dominant historical narratives is what aligns the work of community archives with ethnic studies. Despite its location in a mainstream archival institution, the C nevertheless reflected an ethos and commitment to centering the perspectives of those on the margins of society and of history, inviting community input and reference and outreach strategies that extended well beyond the walls of the university. Thus, I embrace wholeheartedly the fluid approaches to community archiving in my professional role as a curator, librarian, archivist. Archival work has never been just a profession for me. much like the popular slogan of the 1960s second wave feminists who insist that the personal is political. My work in archival stewardship has always been political and personal, more than a professional pursuit. The histories I help to preserve and disseminate reflect some of my own history as a child refugee who resettled in the United States in the 1980s. Born after the Vietnam-American War officially ended, my life was nevertheless shaped by its prevailing narratives and legacies. So this is, and you don't see the placard that I'm holding, but this is me. This is my refugee identification photograph. It's the very first photograph that I have of myself. I have no baby pictures. So I was about 3.5 or 4 years old, and we were in a refugee camp. It could have been Malaysia, it could have been the Philippines. My family can't remember. My family's silences around the Vietnam-American War and our refugee journey led me to pursue this history by means of collecting oral histories from community members starting in the early 2000s in San Diego during my ethnographic field research. The oral history work led me to archival stewardship and curation of community histories, rerouting my professional journey. This personal experience is important in contextualizing the relationships I fostered with community members as the representative of the university. So too, this personal experience colored my views of collection development, donor relations, archival appraisal, description, and curatorial practices. Looking at the records preserved in the Southeast Asian Archive, I saw silences and absences. I saw the shadow of state surveillance and hegemonic truths centering white saviors, which cast my community as war victims. I saw the ways my community became intelligible to researchers merely as objects of rescue. Refugees from Southeast Asia were documented quite prolifically during the Cold War and in the post-Vietnam War years. The majority of the seized collections on refugees and immigrants were from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were compiled and donated mainly by white aid workers and volunteers, educators, or former foreign service officers. This created a condition where the knowledge about a vulnerable population continued to be bolstered by archival documentation created about us by others in relative positions of authority and power. Consequently, early records about Cambodian, Hmong, Lao, and Vietnamese refugees and immigrant communities within the Southeast Asian Archive reflect a colonial gaze, an affliction embedded in Western archival traditions. And I'm not going to scroll through the Online Archive of California, which is our union database for finding aids for California repositories, but this one is a landing page for the Southeast Asian Archive. And if you scroll through, you'll see this kind of preponderance of names of non-Southeast Asians, like the Bashel scrapbooks and the Mitchell Bonner photographs and the Kathy Bucot's collection and the Michael Burr photographs. There are quite a few that I brought in during my time that have been recently processed, the Cambodian family records, for example, Cambodian rock band, that are more community-centered than the historic ones that I came to inherit when I joined in 2013. So after decades of war, followed by displacement from their homelands, refugees faced yet another type of violence and displacement in their lives. Systematic erasure from state archives in Vietnam and top-down documentation in the West of refugees as victims in need of rescue engendered a form of epistemic violence that endures in our everyday meaning-making, inflecting the stories we tell about ourselves. The double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois has described as a veil through which a subjugated person views themselves can also describe the bind that refugees find themselves in. Framed through a narrative of debt and gratitude owed to their quote-unquote savior nation states, Vietnamese refugees' identities are fraught politically and imbued with this double consciousness. Performing the role of the good refugee has been a survival reflex for many Vietnamese Americans, but this adherence to being good and not stirring up any trouble as guests in this country has also disallowed certain forms of solidarity, such as mobilizing for racial justice and supporting emerging refugee populations. As this brief historical context on the Vietnamese refugee experience suggests, archiving community history requires attention to power, positionality, and ongoing negotiations of collective identity. What do we do then to address these complex issues and compel the LIS profession towards redressing the hurts of history? to paraphrase Jameson. I suggest we teach or transform education, archives, and community history. Whoops, I'm missing a slide. So Douglas Ballin Lapp and Meg Beggy introduced a person-centered archival theory and praxis as a means of shifting the discussion from a focus on records to the people that create, keep, use, and or are represented in records. Person-centered archival theory and praxis recognize that records are not merely static objects, but are intimately tied to the people who create, keep, use, and are represented within them. This approach places individuals and their experiences at the forefront of archival considerations, emphasizing the human element within the archival context. So by challenging archivists to consider the social, cultural, and personal contexts that shape the creation, use, and meaning of records, we see how records are imbued with personal and social significance. There are several implications for archival theory and practice in taking seriously this person-centered approach. We call attention to the importance of community engagement and collaboration, and recognize the expertise and authority of historically marginalized groups in shaping archival collections and narratives. This approach also calls for recognizing the multiple and sometimes conflicting truths within these narratives and within these archives. We emphasize the ethical responsibilities of archivists to ensure that the creation, preservation, and use of records are respectful, empathetic, and sensitive to the rights and well-being of individuals and communities involved. It asks archivists to actively consider issues of privacy, consent, and cultural sensitivity in their work. A person-centered approach also attends to archival legibility, to borrow from Jamie Lee's framing. And this is the slide. Lee asserts, whenever community archives are situated at the intersections of university institution, there are degrees of vulnerability that should be considered and addressed. What does it take for community archives to be legible? How then does legibility play a role in legitimacy? Consider the role that community archives have played in non-dominant communities to legitimate lived and living histories that are often erased, obscured, and marginalized. I didn't want to use so many block quotes, but it was so beautifully written, I just popped it all in. So TEACH is an acronym I created in 2020, actually, during the COVID-19 pandemic, while the team I worked with at UCI was wrapping up one grant project and grappling with the what now question that often accompanies these term-limited, soft-funded grants. TEACH stands for our Transforming Education, Archives, and Community History, aptly framing our aspiration to support marginalized communities in the work of preserving and providing access to their histories on their own terms. This work also empowers educators and historians to further challenge dominant narratives. So essentially, we hope that we aspire for this approach to ripple outwards, not just within our profession, but within other fields. We aspire to do this from our location within an academic institution with all the opportunities and all the limitations that this includes. This is an approach we solidified after a 3-year Institute of Museum and Library Services, Transforming Knowledge, Transforming Libraries, TKTL. I didn't come up with that acronym, research project. This research project, am I missing some slides? There it is. Through this research project, Audra Eagle-Yoon, Crystal Tribbett, Jimmy Zavala, and I, pictured here, examined the intersection between ethnic studies and community archives, asking how academic libraries might become key partners in providing undergraduate students with the tools and training to document, preserve, and disseminate community history. Witnessing a majority of funding going to graduate studies and training, we saw a need to diversify the LIS profession much earlier through working with undergraduate students. So we argued that teaching at an earlier point in the collegiate experience makes students aware of the importance of libraries and archives, helps students understand the impact they can have in shaping their own narratives, and fosters critical thinking by empowering students to challenge the exclusion they might face in mainstream archival institutions and historical narratives. From this research, we developed what we call the Community-Centered Archives Practice or Partnership, or CCAP. CCAP is a model of archival work based on several core tenets: collaboration with community stakeholders, critical interrogation of our collections and knowledge gaps. That's a really hard one for institutions like academic libraries. And shared authority and flexibility in how we work with diverse communities. Flexibility is really, really essential. CCAP also involves teaching, outreach, archival practice, and curatorial work. At the core, it's about scaffolding support for the creation, preservation, and access to historical materials by and about groups that are marginalized in mainstream archives through partnership with faculty, students, and most importantly, community organizations. And this is important. We expanded the field of engagement to include community organizations that are not necessarily defined as archives or cultural heritage or memory organizations. So here are a couple of organizations that we've worked with. They range from social services and health advocacy groups to churches and community garden collectives. So in order to dismantle white supremacy and patriarchy deeply embedded within traditional archives, we believe that it's essential to imagine possibilities not yet explored in our institutional settings. The TKTL research data, of which we published like a 60-page report, demonstrates a compelling connection between community archives and ethnic studies, particularly the ways that students express feelings of belonging, hope, inspiration, and motivation when they could see themselves or their communities reflected in the historical record. One undergraduate student who participated in TKTL asserted that I learned that the documentation of histories from marginalized communities is important in creating new knowledges. In this way, it is even more powerful to have communities themselves document their own history on their own terms. Their own words, not mine. The students' reflection centers the values already expressed by activists fighting for ethnic studies since the 1960s. Ethnic studies arose from the social movement era, as well as the Third World Liberation Front's demands for relevant education. That is, education that reflected the perspectives and lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, which is a newer phrasing than Third World Liberation or Third World. Our TKTL report, and this is a poster that was created during that era. You can find it on San Francisco State's digital archives. This is one of our findings from the TKTL report. We found that both community-based archives and ethnic studies address the issue of communities being left out, removed, or underrepresented in the historical record. Each area empowers individuals and communities by directly engaging them in critical analysis in the case of ethnic studies, or in the creation and distribution in the case of community archives of their knowledge and information. Community-based archives and ethnic studies scholarship have a symbiotic relationship building upon each other. Grassroots social movements and archiving marginalized histories are necessary conditions and methodologies to create and challenge historical knowledge. TKTL also helped us articulate the importance of compensating students and community partner organizations to participate in the work of building up capacity for community history. Paid student internships would offer a strategic avenue for engaging community organizations that did not have the staff capacity to preserve their records or document their histories. Leveraging our location at a research university, we partnered with faculty to recruit undergraduate students into a 10-week training and internship program. Students were trained in community archives principles and practices, which included basic oral history methods. Students from historically disadvantaged groups in higher education cannot easily take on unpaid internships. And I know all of you know this, but it really bears repeating. And university libraries are not course credit granting units. So the most equitable approach we could think of was to ensure that students who participated in our program could get paid. Paying students and placing them with community organizations required that we navigate a bureaucratic academic library system that is slow to change its workflows in support of liberatory practices of community engagement. But here are some photographs of workshops, community-based archiving workshops with the students that have participated with us through the years. By the time I started thinking about actionable steps towards transforming education, archives, and community history, I was already 2 decades into volunteer work with nonprofit community-based organizations in Southern California, mostly arts organizations. I learned how community partnerships built on respect, shared authority, and expertise and mutual aid might present a roadmap for us to push our institutions to care, centering people and communities rather than collections and prestige. Teach is an aspiration grounded in practical strategies we can enact toward liberatory memory work at the level of our educational and archival institutions. What would it look like to transform these institutions that were not built for BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and people who live with disabilities? What would it take to push our institutions to enact a care approach? So these are some of the tenets of this care approach, and I'll elaborate a little bit on each bullet point. In community-centered archives practice and partnerships, or CCAP, we believe in the following. The first, the C is collaborative, which means sharing authority with community members. In a community-centered archives approach, the institution focuses on shared authority, making decisions together and respecting the value, expertise, and perspectives brought to the partnership by community members, whether they have archival training or not. The second point is being attentive to inequities reflected in archives. Institutional actors should seek to understand how communities have been misrepresented, absented, or maligned in historical documentation in order to frame their approach to partnership with nuance and sensitivity. This requires a willingness to do the necessary homework or research. The next point is about being responsive to the community's needs. An institution must be flexible, adaptable, and take an iterative and ethical approach to responding to how community memory and evidence is preserved, described, and made accessible. This might involve a willingness to bend and stretch how archival work is defined to reflect what matters to the community. And finally, the E is for engaging with the diverse priorities of community. So community institution partnerships must vary depending on the needs of who you're working with. Seems like a very kind of matter-of-fact or logical idea, but it's actually quite difficult for academic libraries in particular that really wants a standard or a one-size-fits-all model of work, right? So we continually have to push for these kinds of iterative responses. So at the 2013 Community Informatics Research Network Conference in Prato, Italy, Gilliland and Flynn had a joint keynote on community archiving. And they introduced Gilliland's CARE framework, and CARE for her stood for culturally aware, respectful, and ethical. It's as a complement to her previous VIA or voice identity activism framework. So I'll be honest that I didn't know about Anne's acronym when I developed ours, when we articulated our kind of learnings from working with community, but I find that it's in great alignment, right? We share many of Gilliland's principles, particularly in centering the needs and well-being of community. Gilliland and Flynn explain that CARE emphasizes global stewardship and works from the mainstream archives in, as opposed to the community and its archive out. In developing our CARE approach that specifically addresses academic libraries and institutions' partnerships with community, I'm recognizing both the challenges and opportunities that we have to do this work better in this configuration. My colleagues at the UCI Library Special Collections and Archives continue the work of CCAP Teach through a Mellon Foundation grant that we were awarded in 2022, just before I abandoned ship and went to UCLA. And this work includes cultivating commitment among higher education institutions to community-centered archives approaches, solidifying the ability and responsibility of academic libraries to engage critically and contribute to social justice-focused scholarship, training, pedagogy, and partnership in their communities. This work takes time and involves many moving parts. One of the most crucial elements of this work is training students. While they're paid by the academic library, they work directly with community-based organizations to transform education, archives, and community history. One graduate student who worked on CCAP wrote the following in his blog post in terms of reflecting on his experience with CCAP. Accordingly, we undertake a novel approach that shifts power dynamics from a bottom-to-top hierarchy to one of lateral recognition in community archives. In other words, the goal is not devolution, but rather partnership. At the core of this worldview is the acknowledgement that both institutional actors and community members bring unique skills and identities to the construction of history. We do not impose or bestow historical knowledge. We recognize and appreciate it together. Teach or transforming education, archives, and community history is an aspiration. It's an aspiration that led me to the role I'm in today as an LIS educator. Every project, partnership, and pedagogical opportunity I've had in my professional journey is predicated on the belief that another university is possible. I encountered this protest slogan while reading about ethnic studies struggles of the late 1990s. Again, this kind of second wave, when universities were defunding ethnic studies and student activists sounded the alarm to mobilize for higher education that could challenge existing power structures, promote social justice, and seek to create more inclusive, equitable, and transformative learning environments. The slogan reflects the aspirations of activists who believe in the potential of universities to foster progressive change in society. We have to believe that transformation is possible in order to keep doing this work. But how do we keep moving forward when we encounter roadblocks in the shape of our institutions' bureaucracies, whilst we also navigate the complexities with working with vulnerable communities? How do we sustain our energies and commitments for the long haul? Flexibility, as I mentioned before, is paramount in community-centered archives work. In my decade of working in an academic library, I found that archivists and library administrators are not typically the most flexible people. They like workflows, standards, controlled vocabularies. I hear some giggling, so there might be some truth to them. All the elements of an orderly and organized regime of information. I suggest that we keep pushing our profession towards flexible practices that enable us to sustain care for the people and communities that have been harmed by our institutions. The way forward is not always clear, and I don't have all the answers to navigating every roadblock or every naysayer in your way. I don't have a sense of, every institution sort of specific bureaucracies, right? However, I most assuredly would not have continued on this journey to become an LIS educator at a public university if I did not believe that there are always ways to sustain ourselves in this work. First, caring in the archival context should also include caring for ourselves. Practicing intentionality in this work means we have to be honest about our own capacities. And I have found myself walking away from folders and boxes that have just been too much, more times than I can count. I'm really working on this part. I'm working on this practice of intentionality. Second, we should not do any of this alone. Right? And even you lone arrangers, there might be some here or on the Zoom. I'll say this, find those accomplices that you can strategize with as you work to hold those in power accountable. Your people may not work in the library or archives. This might mean working with media outlets, right? When situations arise that call for public accountability. And third, I often share the strategy of apologize later. In my past experience, I've had some success trying something new and under the radar, and then packaging the success of community engagement for an administration that loves a good success story. The story of Anne Frank, the story that Anne Frank often tells me, the librarian who founded the Southeast Asian Archive, and she's still around. She tells me every time we visit is that no one paid any attention to her as she was developing this collection in her basement office, right, centering Southeast Asian refugees. She did it anyway. She just slowly went about her business and probably didn't have to apologize in the end once she garnered enough support. And lastly, and let me end with this, in terms of thinking about ways to sustain yourself and working with others is if you're in the mindset of being willing to do the hard thing, it will be a lot easier to kind of wrap your mind around attending to the challenges ahead. So thank you. Let me stop there and put up this last slide. I want to just thank my colleagues at UC Irvine, Audrey Eagle, and Crystal Tribbett. Jimmy Zavala is now at UCLA as a special collections librarian, and Professor Judy Wu, who is a longtime collaborator on making good trouble at UCI on a lot of projects with great acronyms.